So welcome. My name is Katie Pate. If you don't know who I am, I'm the State Floodplain Management Coordinator within the New Hampshire Office of Planning and Development. That is within the larger state agency of the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. Our department is the state coordinating agency of the National Flood Insurance Program in New Hampshire. This webinar is the first in a two-part series titled Flood Maps Are Changing. And this webinar series will cover what the new maps mean for your community. This webinar, again, is intended for community officials of communities in Grafton County who are receiving new maps that go effective in February of next year as part of the Pemigewasset River Watershed. So as I just mentioned, this is the first in a two-part series. Today's webinar is the first in that series. We're covering what these new maps mean for your community. The second webinar, which will be held next Monday, will cover preparing your residents and business owners for when those new maps become effective. As you can see, each webinar has two sessions. Both sessions of each webinar is the same exact material, same presentation. So the presentation you're seeing right now is the same exact presentation that was held this morning at 10 a.m. And similarly, next week on the 18th, the same presentation will be given at 10 a.m. at 6 p.m. as well. So just please, if you want to attend any of them, just pick whatever one works best for your schedule, or you can attend both if you want. It's totally up to you. Also of note, if anybody is of interest, we are planning to offer our NFIP basics class in early 2024. That date has not been announced at this time, but we'll send out an email via our floodlines distribution list once that is scheduled. We'll also post it on our website as well. We do have a past recording of that NFIP basics training that was held back in June of this past year. That's available on our YouTube page if you don't want to wait until early 2024 when that next class will be held. So let's begin by covering some logistics of this webinar first quickly. This webinar is being recorded. We will be posting it onto our YouTube page afterwards as well, so you can always refer back to it or share it with anybody else in the community that maybe wasn't able to attend tonight or earlier today. All attendees will have their cameras and mics turned off for the duration of the presentation. Once we get to the Q&A section at the end, you'll then be able to turn your microphone on and ask a question verbally if you'd like, but you're also able to type any questions into the chat feature as we go along as well. So here's our agenda for this webinar. We'll first be discussing the new flood maps that will become effective on February 8th, 2024. This discussion will include what the flood maps are, how they are changing, and how you can view the new maps. Then we'll be discussing what that means for your community, including the map adoption process, including any ordinance revisions, the use of the new maps as best available data, and then any potential flood insurance implications for residents and business. Then we'll have plenty of the time for Q&A at the end. I don't expect this taking the entire hour and a half. Typically, we've been running about an hour. We just wanted to leave plenty of time for however many questions we get at the end. So let's start and dive a bit deeper into what are the flood maps and how are they changing. So the flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs, or flood maps as they are commonly called, are produced by FEMA and show the different flood zones for an area. The maps also come with accompanying flood insurance study reports, or FIS reports, that contain more information about those maps. The FIRMs are used by community officials to determine which areas of the community are subject to their floodplain development regulations, which then determines which building requirements apply for development in that floodplain area. The FIRMs are also used by lenders to determine which properties are required flood insurance as a condition of their mortgage. They also are used by the general public to understand flood risk in either their area that they live in or any particular area they may be interested in. So what is shown on these maps is the 1% annual chance flood. This is the magnitude flood that has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. This is the standard that was chosen for use by the National Flood Insurance Program. Obviously, larger and more severe floods can and do happen, just as smaller and less severe floods can and do happen. This flood, again, that 1% annual chance flood, is also commonly called the base flood or the 100-year flood. So just know that those all mean the same thing, even though they're different terminology. The area of the 1% annual chance flood on the firm on that flood insurance rate map is called the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA. So lots of acronyms to remember, I know. So again, that special flood hazard area on the maps, again, that is the area with that 1% annual chance flood event. That is divided into different flood zones, and those flood zones start with either the letters A or the letters V. So these zones, beginning with the letters A or V, are considered the high-risk areas. These are shown as blue on the maps and include a regulatory floodway as well if that area is designated in your particular community, which is shown as a red and blue hatch. Let me get my laser pointer here. So anywhere shown in blue on the screen here, so here you have some zone A, you have zone A, you have zone AE here. This is that regulatory floodway, that red and blue hatch. This is all that 100-year flood, meaning that 1% annual chance of flood happening in any given year. And this area of that special flood hazard area where that blue is, that's where your floodplain regulations apply in your community. Some communities have adopted a higher standard. That means their floodplain regulations apply in areas outside of that. But for the majority of communities in New Hampshire, it's in the special flood hazard area, which is that blue. This area, special flood hazard area, is also where that mandatory purchase requirement would be. So if somebody has a federally backed mortgage or loan and their house or structure is located in that special flood hazard area, they would be required to have flood insurance for the life of that loan or mortgage as well. Now, the area outside of the special flood hazard area, that's called Zone X. So on these newer digital maps, that would be anywhere out here that's not shaded. So just this aerial imagery. It also includes this brown or orange area, which I'll talk about in just a second. That's all Zone X. So these are the low to medium risk areas where your floodplain regulations most likely do not apply. There would also not be any mandatory insurance purchase requirements in this zone as well. On the older maps, Zone X has different types of shading. So just be sure if you're looking at older maps that don't have the digital background, that you're just really looking at the legend to ensure you're correctly interpreting what zone a property is on that map. Now, I mentioned this orange. Well, I should say on my monitor, it's orange. I've been told on some monitors it looks brown. But so this orange-browned area, this is actually the 500-year flood, or that 0.2% chance flood of happening in any given year. Now, as far as the National Flood Insurance Program goes and your floodplain regulations, remember that utilizes the 100-year flood, the blue areas, the blue, and technically this blue and red hatch here, which is the floodway. But just know as a tool that FEMA also puts that 500-year flood on these maps as well. Sometimes that's used in design and location for critical facilities, but just know that's also on these maps. So another thing that's shown on the maps is what's called base flood elevation, or the BFE. This is the height to which floodwater would be expected to rise in the 1% annual chance flood event. So on the examples on the screen, starting with the top image, the BFE is shown on the map with the wavy line with that BFE information right there. I believe that's 237 feet. On the example of the map at the bottom, you would see the elevation is put, that base flood elevation is put in parentheses underneath, so elevation 9. These are from different, the reason these maps and those BFEs differ so much is that the BFE is actually based on a vertical datum. It's not a depth of water. So for example, this isn't saying 9 feet of water, it's 9 feet above that vertical datum. This is saying 237 feet, not because it's 237 feet of water. The elevation is 237 based off that vertical datum. So why this varies so much is I'm assuming this is more coastal. So this is probably like, lower, closer to sea level, versus this is probably somewhere else in the state where I pulled this example from, which is higher elevation compared to like mean sea level, for example. So in addition to the base flood elevations, the maps also show the regulatory floodway. Again, this is that red and blue hatch striped shown on the map. This is shown along some rivers and streams, as shown here in the example. The regulatory floodway is the channel of a river or adjacent land area that must be reserved in order to discharge the base flood without increasing that water surface elevation. This regulatory floodway is also where the fastest moving water will flow during that 1% chance flood. So for those reasons, there's much more stringent building requirements in the regulatory floodway compared to the other flood zones in your community. So the flood insurance rate maps are accompanied by the flood insurance study report, or the FIS report. And that FIS report contains much more detailed supplemental information to what is shown on the firm. So this includes the flood map analysis that were used to prepare the map, and also several important tables and charts that include more base flood elevation information. So now let's talk about how these maps are being updated. So FEMA is currently updating flood maps, or the FIRMs, across not only most of the country, but most of New Hampshire. This process is called Risk Map, map being capital MAP, that stands for Mapping, Assessment, and Planning. This is a multi-step process that takes several years to complete. We do have a fact sheet and a training video on our website that goes over this process in very detailed level of explanation, but I'll provide some high level detail in the next few slides for this presentation. That being said, of these risk map projects are all completed at the watershed level, but then the maps are released at the county level. So for the new flood maps that become effective on February 8th of next year, those maps were part of the risk map project for the Pemigewasset River Watershed, but they've actually only released the maps for the communities in Grafton County at this point. So for example, the communities in Belknap County, New Hampshire that were part of the Pemigewasset River Watershed, they have not had preliminary maps released at this time. Only Grafton County has had the new maps released as part of this watershed. So this risk map project for the Pemigewasset River Watershed covers 30 communities in Grafton County. Those communities are noted on the slide. You have it. I put in a map form and also put it in a table. There are 5 communities that have no new special flood hazard areas indicated on the new maps. Those 5 communities are the town of Canaan, town of Easton, town of Enfield, town of Haverhill, and the town of Lyme. All other communities listed have updated special flood hazard areas on all or a portion of their community map panels. As I just noted on the previous slide, this project is completed at the watershed level. Unfortunately, water does not follow political boundaries, so it would be extremely helpful if it did, right? So just know that as many communities in this watershed are receiving new maps, not all these communities are receiving new maps that cover their entire community. Some are only receiving new maps for a portion of their community. Some are receiving new maps for all of their community. It kind of just depends on where the watershed boundary falls within their community political boundaries. So let's talk about the risk map project process in general and what led up to this point of having new maps for these communities. So this risk map process, again, the process FEMA uses to update all the flood insurance rate maps, can be broken down into 4 phases. So phase 1 is called the discovery phase. This is where FEMA will determine whether a mapping project is needed, and if so, what the scope of that project will be. FEMA typically holds a discovery meeting with local community officials, which for this project was held on December 11th of 2018. Which was used to gather perspective on local natural hazards and to prioritize future mapping projects as part of this. FEMA also published a discovery report for the Pemigewasset River Watershed, which was published on February 24th, 2020 as well. So the second phase includes the analysis and mapping. So during this phase, FEMA works with its partners to conduct the engineering analysis that leads to that initial creation of the new draft work maps. FEMA typically holds a draft work map review meeting with community officials to review the draft maps and provide early feedback on those draft versions. And this meeting for the Pemigewasset River Watershed was held on March 30th, 2021, and then April 6th, 2021 as well. The third phase of the risk map process includes the preliminary flood map release, which is where FEMA releases the preliminary FIRMs and FIS report to the public. They're made publicly available and for public knowledge. So for the 30 communities here in Grafton County, that occurred on December 13th, 2021. FEMA then holds a CCO meeting. CCO stands for consultation coordination officer meeting, and that's held with community officials to review the preliminary firms, discuss what changed, and answer any questions those community officials may have. This was held on February 16th, 2022 for Grafton County. Following that, a 90-day appeal period is held where the public can submit technical data to support a request if they believe those preliminary maps to be incorrect. And this 90-day appeal period was held for Grafton County from October 2022 to January 2023. And then the fourth and last stage of the risk map process is the map adoption stage, where we are now. It's a very exciting stage because you finally get to have those new maps in place and to be utilized. So this phase begins when FEMA issues a letter of final determination, or LFD, that indicates the final effective date of those new maps. The LFD also kicks off a 6-month compliance period for communities to adopt or amend their floodplain regulations with that new map date. So in Grafton County, the LFD was issued on August 8th, 2023, and the new maps will become effective on February 8th, 2024. FEMA is planning to hold an open house for both community officials and the public, where they will have mapping and insurance specialists available to answer any questions. I do believe this is tentatively scheduled for January. I don't know the official date or location has been confirmed, but from what I've heard, they're looking to schedule that open house in January for your communities and for your citizens as well. Again, if you have any further questions about the risk map process in general, please feel free to reach out to our office. Again, we have a fact sheet and that training video available as well, which I'll be sure to share and follow up after this presentation. So for this mapping project, several communities have updated or newly added flood zones, floodway boundaries, and base flood elevations in their new floodplain maps. So the studies behind these new maps include using techniques such as riverine flood hazard analysis, Zone A approximate flood hazard analysis, and the use of the newest topographic information. This includes newest LIDAR, orthotopography, and the inclusion of the vertical datum NAVD 1988. So the following table of the flood zones mapped in each community as part of these new maps that go effective on February 8th. So this information is available from the flood insurance study, that FIS report. That's actually where I generated this table from. So as you're looking here, you're probably looking for your community specifically, but just as a reminder, zones starting with the letter A, so that's zones A, AE, or AO. Those are the high-risk areas and where your floodplain regulations apply. In Zone X is that low-medium risk area where for the majority of communities, your floodplain regulations do not apply in those areas. So as you can see, on the first example, town of Alexandria, they have flood zones A, AE, and then Zone X. But then down below at town of Ashland has A, AE, and also Zone X. So why the map floodplain boundaries may be different in this new maps versus the previous effective maps that were finalized in 2008. So for some map panels, the floodplain boundaries may be different. And the reason for that is that those studies that were completed for the new maps, they include updated hydraulic and hydrologic analysis. They include the use of new topographic and aerial imagery. It also included any new or modified bridges, culverts, or dam that may have impacted floodplain areas. Stream channels may have changed, and also just different development that's occurred in all the communities in this area that may have affected those floodplains over the many years to then make those boundaries change as well. So with this risk map project, there are actually two types of products that are provided: regulatory products and non-regulatory products. So let's start with regulatory products, which include those firms, the flood insurance rate maps, the FIS report, which is the flood insurance study report, and then the firm database. I don't talk much about the firm database, and if you don't know what that is, the firm database is actually all of the data that's included on the flood insurance rate maps in the flood insurance study, but just in GIS data that you can use and input in like ArcGIS, for example. For non-regulatory products, these products supplement the flood hazard information that's produced by those regulatory firm and FIS report. The non-regulatory products include water surface elevation grids and flood depth grids. These are intended to be used for a deeper analysis of flood risk, including the ability to view visualize local flood risk, allow communities to make informed decisions about reducing flood loss, and then also mitigating potential damage from flood hazards. So now we're going to talk quickly about each of these products individually. So let's start with discussing regulatory products, specifically those firms, the flood insurance rate maps. So with these new maps, introduce a new format of the firm, including a change in layout and shading. As you can see, the new firm over here, it's much more vertical. All of the information that was previously on the side of each of the maps is now located in the bottom. There's also a new firm panel format, so that legend has been updated. There's no more dotted areas within the special flood hazard area. The coloring has been changed. The floodway designation colors have also been changed. The firm also includes a panel locator now. That's what's shown here on the right, and that is used to make it easier to determine the numbers of the adjacent panels as well. The firm panel format has also been updated. So for most panels, the suffix on the new maps is changing from suffix E to suffix F. And that advancement in that letter of the suffix just indicates that the map is having its next iteration of a physical map revision. So here is the number of firm panels for each community that is receiving an update, hence the number of panels in your community that are going to be dated February 8th, 2024. So your community may actually have more panels than what's listed on this table. They just probably were not updated as part of this project because they were probably outside that watershed boundary of the Pemigewasset River Watershed. So just as an example, the first town on the list here, the town of Alexandria, they've had 12 panels updated as part of this project. The town of Ashland below it has only had 7 panels updated as part of this process, and et cetera, as you look throughout the rest of the table. The next regulatory product is the Flood Insurance Study Report, again, the FIS report. So the FIS report reflects the new date. It's obviously going to be dated February 8th, 2024. It's also been broken down into 4 volumes this time. I believe before it was only 3 volumes, but now it's actually longer and it's 4 volumes. With the new FIS report, there's also a new format of the firm map index, which I think is much more easier to read and understand and actually visually see which map panels apply in your community. So now let's talk about the non-regulatory products that are available. So the first non-regulatory product is the water surface elevation grids. So this water surface elevation data allows community officials to better understand and communicate the different flood heights across a floodplain. Those flood depth grids, they work in ArcGIS. Once that data is, imported, those layers are uploaded into ArcGIS. It's simply the point of being able to point and click on any location and view that base flood elevation for that corresponding area. It's my understanding that although these grids are part of FEMA's non-regulatory flood risk products, they can still be a good tool for floodplain management, so that 1% annual chance elevations are in line with the elevations in the regulatory firm at the time of the firm creation. Obviously, as time goes on and any letters of map change occur in your community, other type of development occurs in the floodplain in your community, unless this flood water surface elevation grid is updated, it may not match as accurately to those regulatory products as it does at the time of its creation. There are 2 fact sheets related to this water surface elevation grids, a technical and a non-technical one, and I'll be sure to send out links afterwards as well in case anyone is learning or interested in learning more about them. Then the second non-regulatory product are the flood depth grids. So flood depth grids allow community officials to better understand, investigate, and communicate the variability of flood depths in areas identified as flood prone. So flood depth grids illustrate the flood depth in feet above that ground surface, and they could be much more easier to understand than those base flood elevations that are provided for that 1% annual chance storm. Just like the water surface elevation grids, the flood depth grids work in ArcGIS. It's the same type of situation where you can simply, once that information is uploaded into the system, you have those layers turned on, you can simply point and click for any location that's available to see what that water surface depth would be. Just to know and to clarify the difference between that water surface elevation grid and the flood depth grid, is that while they're very similar, this flood depth grid is measured in feet from the ground, where that water surface elevation grid that I mentioned on the slide previously is measured from that vertical datum. So it just depends on which way you're looking at it. The flood depth grid also has 2 fact sheets that I'll be sure to share afterwards as well, in case any community is interested in learning more. I will be perfectly transparent that I have very little, and when I say very little, I have 0 experience with both the water elevation grid and the flood depth grids. I have not used them before. My understanding is that they will be available for these communities in Grafton County that are receiving the new maps. I just wanted to share them because I figured they could be a really good tool to know about if you're doing master planning, local hazard mitigation planning, whatever that may be. So I just wanted you all to be aware, but I have not personally used them, so I'm not quite sure with how they work as well, but I just wanted to make everybody aware. So now let's talk about how letters of map change that have already been issued. So letters of map change, including letters of map revisions and letter of map amendments, how that were previously issued for the current maps, how those will be affected or shown on the new maps. So when these new maps become effective in February, those maps will supersede any LOMAs or letters of map change, that's letter of map amendments, excuse me, and the letters of map revisions, any of those map changes, these new maps will supersede them. In my mind, there's kind of 3 different categories of where that falls when those new maps will be released. So the first one is that any letters of map amendment, those, again, the letters of map change, the letter of map revisions, the first one is that they're validated. So there's no change with these new flood insurance rate maps that will become effective in February, meaning it won't say LOMA or LOMAR on the map, but you'll see it will be shown out of the floodplain as if they've taken that information and incorporated it. The second option is that the maps will supersede that LOMA, that LOMAR, that LOMAC, and they will be void. So meaning that FEMA, when they did their analysis, they actually found that that property was in the floodplain. And now, while they might have had a LOMA beforehand, now they've gone back and they're actually in the floodplain again. And then the third category under what happens is for when there's multiple lots involved, and that is when FEMA has put them back in the floodplain and basically mentioned them as redetermined. So that means that that property owner might have to go back and issue a new, or apply for a new LOMA, I should say, for those multiple lots at that point. So when that letter of final determination was issued for each community, you should have also received what's called a summary of map actions, a SOMA form. And what that does, it's list all of the letters of map amendments, letters of map revisions, and letter of map changes for your community. And it actually lists out which ones were validated and which ones were superseded. If you don't have that at your community, or maybe it was sent to somebody else and you're not quite familiar with it, or you just don't remember getting it, I believe I received at the state level copies for all these communities. You're a copy of that SOMA, that summary of map actions. So just feel free to reach out to me afterwards, or you could type it in the chat here and I can send that, that form to each community if you're interested. So let's talk about how to access the new flood maps and the FIS report. There's going to be many different ways and tools to do that. So first, the first kind of one-stop shop is the FEMA Map Service Center. That's msc.fema.gov. This is where you'll be able to view and download all of the regulatory and non-regulatory products. So that address again is msc.fema.gov. I find the easiest way when you're on their website is to first go in the left-hand menu and search click on the MSC search all products. Once you're on that page, this is what it looks like. You're going to select the state, New Hampshire, the county, whatever county you may be in, and then also your community. You need to then make sure you hit the big blue search button. I cannot even tell you the amount of times that I have either not hit the search button or I've hit the enter button on my keyboard, and I'm like waiting for it to load just to realize I never hit the blue search button. So once you hit the blue search button, those search results pop up below. You'll see 4 folder options. You'll see the effective products. You'll see the preliminary products if there are any. You'll see pending products if there are any. Pending is what all these Grafton counties are at right now, which means that letter of final determination has been issued and you're in that 6-month period where you have that effective date. And then you'll also see a folder for historic products. So you'll be able to open those folders and then view the firms and FIS reports and that firm database with the GIS data for all those different categories. Another really good tool to kind of in the meantime compare the current effective map and those new pending maps that will be effective in February is the FEMA pending versus effective national flood hazard layer tool. So this screenshot is what the website looks like. And actually, once you zoom into your location or type in your address or whatever area you're interested in, you can actually take this bar in the middle of the screen and you can just drag it back and forth and it will kind of put the corresponding map depending how you drag it. So on this side is the effective map. So this would be the 2008 maps. And on this side are those pending maps that will be effective in February. So you can kind of drag and drop and see how the maps will change for any particular property or any area of a community kind of in this viewer. I think it's a really good tool that I'm trying to share more about with communities. And then once those maps become effective, so after February 8th, they will be available as the most current data on both our New Hampshire Flood Hazard Viewer and FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer Viewer. FEMA does issue paper copies to each community when the new maps become effective. I'm not sure if any communities have received those yet. Like I said, you should get one copy of all the maps. I thought that I feel like I heard from somebody that they maybe had been mailed already. So if once February comes around and you haven't received a copy of those paper maps, please reach out to me and I can connect with FEMA to make sure that they were sent or who they were sent to, etc. So now let's kind of shift and talk about what those map changes mean for your community. So when FEMA updates a community's firm and FIS report with new or revised flood hazard information, each community must update its floodplain regulations to reference the date of that new firm and FIS report prior to the effective date. Additionally, any other changes to the community's ordinance, if needed, must be completed by that effective date in order to remain in good standing in the National Flood Insurance Program. This is explained in much more detail in FEMA's publication, Adoption of Flood Insurance Rate Maps by Participating Communities as well. So communities are only able to update the effective firm and FIS report date once that is issued by FEMA in their letter of final determination, which again, FEMA sends 6 months prior to that effective date. So as this doesn't always line up with the traditional New Hampshire town meeting schedule, there is an RSA in New Hampshire. It's RSA 67457 that allows that firm and FIS report date to be updated through a resolution by the local governing body without any further action by the local legislative body. So our office has already sent out guidance to all communities impacted by this. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can reach out to your community's legal counsel, or if you're a member of New Hampshire Municipal Association, they are also a great resource on learning more on this RSA as well. Here is an example of a resolution that was passed by a community indicating the adoption of the new firm and FIS report, and then the corresponding language being updated in their ordinance. Again, I would recommend if you have any further questions to discuss with your community's legal counsel or the attorneys at New Hampshire Municipal Association, again, are a great resource. So in regards to the use of the new flood map data prior to the effective date, communities are not required to use that new map date for floodplain development prior to that February 8th, 2024. FEMA does encourage the communities to reasonably utilize this information in instances where, say, there's a increase in base flood elevation or the floodways are revised just to ensure the health, safety, and property of your citizens is protected. FEMA has this good document here. It's called Use of Flood Insurance Study Data as Available Data. I'll be sure to send that out in my follow-up afterwards, but it kind of talks about different situations and when you should use what data as you're kind of in this awkward 6-month place where the new maps have not gone effective yet, but you know there's newer and better data out there. So let's talk about how the new maps will affect flood insurance for residents and businesses in your community. So the requirement for flood insurance is determined by the property's current and new flood zone determination. And so that may change with the effective date of this new map. So let's first begin by considering properties that are newly mapped into the high-risk flood zones. So meaning they were in a low-risk flood zone, so they were in zone X, they were in the low risk, and now they're going to be newly mapped into the high risk, which are in Grafton County would be communities with zone A, AE, or AO. So as I mentioned previously, properties with a federally backed mortgage or loan in those high-risk flood zones are required to have flood insurance for the life of their mortgage. For properties that are newly mapped into, again, those flood zones at A, AE, or AO, and they have a federally backed mortgage, they will most likely be receiving a letter from their lender indicating this or their requirement to have flood insurance for the life of that mortgage. The National Flood Insurance Program does offer a low-cost insurance option known as the newly mapped procedure. Under this procedure, newly mapped discounts can be applied to the insurance policy, which would then only gradually increase within the existing statutory limits, which are set by Congress, until that full risk premium is reached. So even if a building is sold during this time, the policy can be transferred and the new owners can continue to have that gradual increase every year until that full risk policy is reached. If at any point that policy is dropped, the next time, if it were to be picked up, it would no longer be considered under that newly mapped rate. It would then go to that full risk premium. So now from properties who are moving from the high risk zone, so they're moving from being in a zone A, AE, or AO, and they're moving to zone X, that low risk zone, they may have their mandatory purchase requirement removed from their federally backed mortgage or loan. That determination is made by the lender, but it could be removed. So while flood insurance can be optional, we always recommend flood insurance for all properties because your risk is only being reduced, not removed. This is a really good brochure that FEMA has. It's called Map Changes in Flood Insurance. It's available digitally. Communities and anybody actually is able to get hard copies of this. So it may be something communities may want to look into ordering some to have, say, at your town hall, or if any property owners or business owners come in. When you order these through FEMA, they're free to get, and FEMA also ships them for free. So the only thing is you just have to wait the 1 to 2 weeks for them to arrive at your community. But I'll send this form out with this PDF because it may be a good tool to have even on your website to help spread the word to your community. And then finally, it's important to get the word out again to residents and business owners about the new maps before they become effective, so that your property owners, so they're aware of the changes and they're able to make any decisions if needed before that time when that change comes. So we do have a toolkit for community officials to help spread the word about the new flood maps. Currently on our website is the preliminary map toolkit, and our pending map toolkit is coming in the next week or so. We're just finalizing it and then able to get it posted on our website. This toolkit includes sample messaging, social media posts, sample website content. We'll be discussing this toolkit in much more detail in its messaging at next week's webinar about educating your property owners and business owners about the new coming maps. So we hope that you're able to join us at that time. Again, if you're not able to join us next week, we'll also be recording those webinars so you can watch it afterwards as well. And with that, that's all I have. I don't have anything else. We can open it up for any questions. Alvina, do you want to allow everybody to be able to unmute themselves?
Yeah, let me do that.
Yeah. So if anybody has a question, you're more than welcome in a second to unmute yourself.
There we go.
Happy to answer.
Okay, so everyone should have access to a mic now, and your mics would be, you should be able to unmute your mic.
Or you can also type it in the chat too if you don't want to unmute yourself. Totally up to you guys, whatever you feel more comfortable with. Or if you have no questions, that's okay too. We just want to give everybody the opportunity.
Oh, we got a question in the chat,
Yep.
Katie.
So in Plymouth, the floods are much more frequent. Do the new maps take that into account? So yes and no. So these maps do have they call it the H&H study, the hydraulic and hydrologic studies behind them. So it does take into account, you'll see that where there's floodplain boundaries that are moved. Of course, remember the NFIP, as I mentioned before, it utilizes the 100-year flood. We can have more larger and more intense floods like they can and do happen. Sometimes those larger floods happen multiple times a year. Just like as we have smaller floods that can and do happen that also probably happen multiple times a year. So that's something to just keep in mind as you're, reviewing the maps and understanding where that data is coming from. I don't know if that answers your question directly, Judy, but hopefully it does. The other thing I often, now that I'm thinking about it, I often tell communities who say they have an area that floods a lot is what's the source of that flooding? Is it flooding that's coming from those rivers overflowing and from lakes overflowing, or is it coming because it's a stormwater control issue too? There's different things. I do know Plymouth does have a very, big history of rivers overflooding with severe flooding. So I totally understand where your question's coming from. But I just mean as a general statement, blanket wide, sometimes not all flooding is coming from like a river. Sometimes it also can be stormwater as well. But hopefully the new maps do give a much more accurate picture of where that 100-year flood would happen in your community than the previous maps that were adopted in 2008. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any.
Oh,
Oh,
I think
Judy's
Judy's
typing.
typing.
Yeah. And Judy, I'm assuming you're from Plymouth. Deborah, if you want to type in the chat just what community you're from, as well, just so we can know who is here today. That would be much appreciated. Thank you. So Judy just said that there are 2 gas stations in this frequently flooded area. Why is it allowed to stay? If you mean why are the gas stations allowed to stay there, that would be up to, your community, your floodplain regulations of what development's allowed. Also, when were those structures built? That kind of depends on to what level, what development regulations they were built to. So if that's what you implied, that might be a bigger conversation to have with, say, like the planning board or other staff at the town level. Thank you, Deborah, for noting where you were from. I appreciate that. Oh, perfect. Judy's from Bridgewater. I appreciate that. Thank you for letting us know. Do you guys have any other questions? And even if you don't have a question now, say you think of a question like tomorrow, you think of it a few hours later, you're like, oh man, that's a good question. I should have thought of it earlier. You can always reach out to me via email or phone as well. I'll put my contact information on the screen actually. And I can follow up with you later on if any questions do come up.
And Katie, you will send out the slides, right? Along with the recording.
Yep. So we're going to send out the recording of this presentation, the slides, and I'll also put links for all of those technical resources that I mentioned throughout the presentation. We'll be sending that out most likely tomorrow. As soon as we can get the recording up on YouTube, we'll send that out. So.
I think Deborah's typing something.
Yeah, I think we got some typing going on. I'm eager to say new maps. We are having someone use map to include housing on. Oh yeah, a great tool that I always tell communities or just officials is if your community uses any type of online GIS service. So a lot of communities will do this with like their tax assessments, their tax maps. There's typically other layers on there such as wetlands, shoreland, etc. Overlaying or including the floodplain maps on that online GIS viewer can be a really helpful tool to kind of visualize where floodplains are in your community as well. Sometimes floodplains are forgotten about, so it's always a really good tool to add. The other thing is, I don't know what capacity people's roles are on this call, but you could also work with your local regional planning commission. They could also probably interact or get the maps into GIS format for you as well if you wanted to look at specific properties or certain areas that you wanted to kind of evaluate more in the community or in your community. Okay. Any other final questions? I'm not seeing anybody else typing. We'll give it another minute. And if I see somebody else typing, oh, I see somebody else. So how can the data person access that map data? I'm assuming you mean like get that GIS data. So to get that GIS data, they can download that from FEMA's Map Service Center. When you get the slides tomorrow, you'll see that's at msc.fema.gov. If you go through that search feature where you go to the search all products in the left-hand column, select your state, which would be New Hampshire, and then your county, and then your community, and you go down to that effective data tab called the firm database. And if you click that to download, that's like the entire GIS data that can be uploaded into ArcMap to use. If your community uses like that online assessing database, I believe sometimes it's called like AXI GIS, with the tax maps and other layers. I would go through whatever contractor you're using to develop and kind of maintain that site. I would go through them and ask them to add the national flood hazard layer to that as well. Great, perfect. Okay, any other questions? We can give it one more minute and see if anybody has anything else.
I think Judy just left.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate people taking the time to be here tonight. Again, we'll be sending a follow-up tomorrow with the recording and all the links, and hopefully we'll see you next week for our next webinar in the series. Thank you.